For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cheng. I'm an Ashoka Support Network member of ASN, and I've been an ASN member since 2007. So I'm actually one of the first ASN members in London. And we have a lot of ASN in London. We have actually more than 30 now, but only about 15 fellows. So those fellows are some of the most over-advised and over-supported fellows in the network, and they have no shortage of people telling them, you know, about business plans and all those things. My background is in finance, so I started my career at Deutsche Bank doing project finance, and about 6 or 7 years ago, I began to do more and more volunteer work with social enterprises in particular, and that was when I first came across Ashoka. So Ashoka launched its program in the UK in 2007, began electing its first fellows. And at that time, purely as a volunteer, you know, this ASN had only just launched at that point in time, I began to do some work using my corporate finance skills to work with those fellows that wanted to raise capital and go beyond just simply raising grants, donations, but actually looking at social finance or some kind of investment offering. And that sort of, you know, began in 2007, and over the last few years it's kind of snowballed and done more and more of that, such that by now I think I've worked with close to about 20 Ashoka fellows in one way or another. So I do a lot of work with the social finance team at Ashoka. I work with a fellow called David Green, who's very active in the healthcare space and in a number of other areas. And with David, we're actually in the process right now of raising a fund to invest in solar energy companies in developing countries called Solar for All. So hopefully that will launch early next year. It's going to be around $20 million in size. And we're also working with healthcare professionals and doing the same thing in the healthcare space. So we also have a fund coming through then, which will be of a similar size, financing healthcare innovations in developing countries. So worked with a lot of different kinds of business models. And so about a year ago, Ashoka invited me to come on board more formally as an advisor at Ashoka UK on finance and financial strategy. You know, when I was thinking about what to talk about for an hour or so today, it seemed to me that the most interesting thing, you know, rather than just simply running through you know, a list of financing options that you might have, and I'm sure you guys are all very familiar with, you know, debt and equity and all those various things, was actually to try and put financing in the context of your growth strategy, you know, because that's really what the Globalizer is all about, is really about how do you take your idea and scale the impact of that. And one of the critical things that Globalizer tries to emphasize is that scaling your impact is not the same thing as scaling your organization. You know, it may very well be the same thing in many cases, but there are other strategies that are out there, like open source, you know, like networks and so on, where you know, maybe that actually isn't the right way to grow your impact in the quickest possible way. And if you're one of those fellows for whom that is not the best way, you know, of scaling your impact, then I think there's two questions. And the first question is, what is the growth model that you're going to be adopting? And the second question is, given your growth model, what is the right way to finance that? You know, because the world of commerce is very familiar with the idea of taking organizations and putting in capital to grow them. It's very unfamiliar with the idea of taking an idea and finding a structure that will enable that idea to proliferate into multiple countries, you know, and grow that. And all the existing mechanisms that exist, you know, debt, equity, you know, whatever they are simply not designed for those kind of growth strategies. So we have to be creative then about thinking about how to do that. So just in terms of the sort of the framework for this workshop, if we could just move to the next slide, please. I put together just three ideas about how to structure this. Firstly, and very quickly, I would just like to go through a couple of definitions about impact investing, just so that we can all be on the same page and be very clear about what we're talking about when we mean social finance and impact investing. The second part, and this is really why I want to spend most of the time, is talking about strategies for scaling. And I hope this will build on everything that you've been doing in the last 24 hours. And so that we won't need, you know, we can go straight in and start talking about some of the various models that are out there for scaling and growing, and how finance fits in with those models. And then the last part of this, if we have time and if we get to that point, I thought what I might do is simply just chuck some ideas at you from various financings that we've seen with entrepreneurs that I've worked with over the last 5 years. And I hope that, you know, one of two things will either will happen at that point. You'll either say, that's an interesting idea, but it's really not for me. It doesn't apply to my model, and that's fine. Or you might say, okay, that is an interesting idea. You know, I could see how I might be able to adapt that to what I'm doing. You know, and there are 4 or 5 things that are out there that have been successfully used by a number of Ashoka Fellows. And I just want to just share them with you and just, you know, just throw them out there and see if that sticks. So moving on then, just very quickly, just to get this out of the way, definitions. You know, when I moved from the world of commercial finance to social finance, you know, I thought I was coming from a very jargon-filled, you know, technocratic environment. And what I realized very quickly was that there is nothing that is more jargon-filled than the field of social finance, and that everybody means something slightly different when they talk about social finance and impact investing. So I just thought I'd just share with you how I define social finance so we can be very clear about it. And with respect to this diagram here, if you think about the kind of people who give you money, they're basically looking for 2 things. They're looking for social impact and they're looking for financial return. Right? They're looking for their money back plus some kind of return. And if you draw this Venn diagram, you can more or less classify investors or donors depending on where they sit in this structure. So for instance, if we go to the next one, on the left-hand side, you see the circle which is social impact. And there are some donors, effectively, who care only about social impact and not about financial return. So they give you a grant, they give you a donation. And that's the universe of grant makers. On the other hand, there are those who only care about financial return. And that's the universe of commercial finance. And then there is this very interesting area which sits in the middle, which is those group of people who care about social impact but also need to make some kind of financial return, even if it's only getting their money back. And that's the area that I'm going to define as social investment. And so just to be clear, I'm going to draw a distinction between social finance or impact investing, which is really the entire circle on the left, which includes grants and donations, as well as social investment, and social investment, which is a subset of that, which is basically money that comes to you, but that expects to be repaid at some point, with some kind of financial return between 0% and fully commercial, which could be up to 15, 20, 25%. Why is it important to draw this distinction? It's because I found when speaking to investors, and indeed to social entrepreneurs, that they use these terms interchangeably and very confusingly. So for instance, you'll often hear this phrase venture philanthropy, which is being spoken about, right? And, you know, and it's very unclear whether venture philanthropy basically means grant giving, but in a very smart way with social impact metrics, you know, and the kind of disciplines that an investor might make, or whether it actually means social investment, which is money that's looking for a return, you know, whatever that return might be. So I want to just draw that distinction in order to avoid some confusion. And then if we, you know, move on from there, if you look at the universe of Ashoka Fellows, there's now 3,000 Ashoka Fellows in the network in 73 countries, so it's got to a huge scale. Ashoka defines social entrepreneur in a really, really broad way. It defines a social entrepreneur as somebody who uses innovative methods to solve a social problem, innovative or entrepreneurial methods to solve a social problem. So right there, when we come and talk about impact investing, we have a potential confusion because the vast majority of people do not see social enterprise and social business as meaning that in the same way that Ashoka defines it. You know, for most people, social business means an organization that uses market-based mechanisms or some kind of you know, product or service which is sold you know, to the public to deliver a social impact. And therefore, on that definition, social business is actually quite a small subset of social enterprise in the Ashoka definition. So, you know, out of the 3,000 fellows, we probably only really have about 500, 600 that actually run some kind of social business in that narrower sense that I'm talking about. And so if you're thinking about social investment, the first and most fundamental question is, you know, are you a social enterprise but not a social business, or are you a social business? In other words, do you actually have some kind of market-based delivery mechanism to deliver your impact? And if the answer is you don't, and in many cases the answer will be you don't, then you shouldn't even be thinking about social investment, because it's going to be a waste of time. And so it's really important to work out right from the beginning whether that makes sense for your model or not. Because again, the worst thing that can happen to you is to have a huge amount of time wasted looking at various options like equity or debt, if fundamentally it doesn't marry with the business model or the delivery model that you have. Now, just out of curiosity, out of the Ashoka Fellows who are in this room, could I just have a quick sense of how many have actually already raised some kind of social investment in the form which I described? In other words, have you already raised some kind of social investment, some kind of, as opposed to grants or donations? Or you already have? Can I ask, what form of investment that is? Is it?
Taking equity stakes in a range of different businesses in different sectors.
Okay.
And we went the route of finding values-aligned partnerships.
Right.
And said to those organizations that were funding us,
yeah.
What if instead of you funding us each year, we had a stake of your business?
I see.
And in return, what we would do is bring you X amount of business from we've got a high network of very influential people.
Mm-hmm.
We're able to bring you X amount of new business.
Mm-hmm.
So no longer give us the grants, give us a stake instead. So we paid nothing for it, and we own minority stakes of a couple of entities.
Oh, I see, right, okay. And in terms of how your investors are looking for their money back in the longer term, are they looking for you to buy the shares back, or are they looking for...
The way it works is that, to take one example, we own 20% of one of these companies, and we would simply then look to the dividends settling the debt. The dividends that is due to us settling the outstanding amount over a period.
Mm-hmm.
So we take 15%, 85% stays in the company to settle the debt, and we do it at prime less X amount for anything over and above.
Right, I see.
And then it's the incentive for us then is to bring in sufficient business from our network to this company so that we're able to settle that as fast as possible so we get the dividends.
Okay. So there's only one entrepreneur who's actually raised equity effectively, or sort of very favorable equity at the moment. Are there others in the room who are thinking about some kind of social investment, but perhaps not sure whether it's the right sort of one for you? I mean, your situation at the moment,
yeah, so
could you...
I think it's the right one. We're launching it, in fact, tomorrow, and I will
okay.
I'm here. Well, my COO is going to do it. So it's we're working with a couple of banks and a couple of investment bankers to put together bond portfolios of promising research.
Mm-hmm.
This is biomedical research.
Okay.
That then would be paid to researchers at the beginning instead of over time like a grant. And the bond would be paid back by the U.S. government agency that would have given the grant money, so National Institutes of Health or BARDA, which is our defense.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay.
So the bond purchasers would be given back a set amount on the dollar, some interest amount. So very much the way highways and bridges and things have been built.
Great. And but basically the source of repayment is the grant that's going to come in at some future stage and do that.
And repay the investors.
I see. And is that based on some kind of success? So if, for instance, the research doesn't demonstrate promise in its early years, the grant may not come through, therefore the bondholder would be at risk, or is it something?
From the National Institutes of Health and Wellcome Trust and some others that are interested, they pay the grant anyway,
right,
regardless of whether the research is successful or not.
Okay.
The difference here is that we will hold the researcher to some good science metrics, not to successful research, because you can't determine which way research is going to go.
Right.
But there would be good science metrics that would determine the payouts that may be in 4 tranches or 2 tranches versus the grants, which are given regardless of whether you do good science or not.
Oh, okay, right. So it's kind of a way of sort of de-risking the proposition for the investor, basically, by giving that IC. Okay,
and also
great.
then giving the government or foundation that's going to pay the grant better metrics than they get right now, because they can't ask for those since their mechanisms don't allow
Okay, right. That's really, really interesting. This diagram that I kind of draw up for social entrepreneurs who are thinking about raising social investment is in many ways one of the key ones for deciding whether you should do this or not. If we could just simply run through the next two. So if you imagine a kind of a forecast of your project, whatever it is, whether it's going to be research into medical genetics or whether it is, you know, selling goods to people in Nicaragua or what have you. Ultimately, as an entrepreneur, you've always got to be able to tell this story, and it basically goes as follows. You say, I have a project and I want to scale this project up, and I believe that I can, through a market mechanism, generate revenue, you know, and so you basically draw out this line which shows revenue hopefully increasing over time. And then you say, in order to deliver that project, it's going to cost me something. So if we look at the costs, you know, and I've drawn it very simply here as just a flat line going across, but in fact it's probably going to be lumpy or it's going to be more front-ended or what have you. The investment story is basically always the same. It is because right now in the early stages we're quite small, our costs exceed our revenue. Therefore, we have a funding need. And that's why we need to raise investment. However, we can project a time going forward when our revenue will be sufficient to cover all of the costs. And not only sufficient to cover all the costs, but actually exceed the costs. And therefore, there will be a profit. And that's basically future profit. And so any investment story that you tell to an investor has got to basically say this. It's got to say, we need the money now, but we can demonstrate or we can project at some point when we'll be break even. And that's kind of this magic moment when these two lines cross. From that moment onwards, we're generating a surplus. And with the surplus, we will use that to repay the investment, or we will use that to create value, which means that your shares could be sold to realize back the value of the investment. And the ratio of these two triangles, the ratio of the blue triangle to the green triangle, essentially represents the level of financial return which is possible in the project, and which you can therefore offer to investors. So this early period is essentially the break-even period. It's the period it takes to get to break-even. And this period beyond this point is the repayment period, which is the period that it takes for you to be able to repay. Now, what sometimes happens when you do the financial analysis is that, if we move to the next slide, is that you may come across a story that's like this. Your costs always exceed your revenues. No matter how much you sell, you're going to be in deficit at all times. And again, with a lot of clients, we run the numbers, and this is quite often the case, particularly with a social model where if this happens, then you've basically got three options. The first option is you've got to change your price in order to raise the revenue. You've got to find some way to lower costs to get it back down to that level, or you simply got to accept the fact that this is never going to be an investable proposition. And if that's the case, it makes no sense to raise equity or debt or any other kind of impact investment. It only makes sense at this point to stay with grants and donations, and that's the right strategy for a model that generally has a profile that looks like this. And so one of the first things we do is run the numbers and look at this and just ask the question, does it even make sense in the first place? Because I have seen entrepreneurs spend 2 to 3 years developing various investment models, and fundamentally the math didn't work. I've also spent some time working with an entrepreneur in the UK who actually has a microfinance model. And when we built the model and ran these numbers, this was the result. And what happened was that entrepreneur went back and he repriced his loans. He actually went back and did it and realized that he could get back to that earlier diagram that I'd shown where you had that intersection. And once he'd done that and done the repricing, he then raised $7 million in impact investment. So there's a lot of value in being able to do this kind of analysis. So that's kind of a precursor to any discussion about impact investment. Does it even make sense given your business model? So that's just a kind of like a couple of definitions. Now, just moving on to the and that was just basically describing what I've just said. So let's talk a bit about strategies for scaling impact, because this is really the key of the Ashoka Globalizer. Is like, what is your model for scaling, and given your model, what are the financing options that are available to you? So let's move on to this then. The way I'm going to try and illustrate this is, if we could just move to the next one. I'm going to represent your social enterprise by this blue dot. Okay, so there's your enterprise that's out there. The next question is, how are you going to scale your impact? Yeah, that is the central question of the globalizer. And essentially, I think there are a number of different templates, a number of different models for how to do this. So one of those models is very straightforward. Grow your organization. Just do more of what you're doing and expand it into different countries. And so this is a model that's adopted by many, many Ashoka Fellows. It's a perfectly sensible model. It has huge advantages in so many ways. It means you have complete control over how your organization advances into a different country. It means that, essentially under this model, you're going out, you're actually building your own teams in different regions, you're hiring your own staff, you're controlling all of the knowledge, all of the IP, all of the delivery. But it also means that you have the responsibility then to fundraise for everything. So this is the model, many, many organizations adopt this. In fact, this is Ashoka, for example. This is what Ashoka does in all of its different countries. One organization, but growing out into these different areas. This could be Dialogue in the Dark. This could be Andreas Heineke's organization, which I think is essentially, he wants to preserve the control of and the delivery of the program. So Dialogue in the Dark, as I understand it, is always run by Andreas and his organization. And so that's, there may be some very good reasons why you may want to do that. Moving on to the next one. So if you have a model that looks like this, it seems to me that there are two critical questions that you should be looking at. The first is, how do you finance your growth? Are you going to be financing your growth by essentially having a central hub that does all the fundraising and then supports all of these subsidiaries that you are launching in different countries? Or do you have a model where you pass down some of the responsibility of that fundraising to your subsidiary countries? What's the relationship between your original HQ, if you like, and the countries and subsidiaries in which you work? I think that's one of the first questions. The second question, which I think is critical, is this: does your business model enable you to transition from a donation-based, grant-funded model to a investment-ready model? Do you actually, in that diagram that I drew earlier, is what you're doing, if it was at sufficient scale, able to get into that blue area where the revenues exceed the costs because you've achieved a certain level of scale? Yeah, that is the critical question as far as I can see, because it's the difference between as your organization grows, you have to keep feeding this enormous beast. Do you have to keep getting more and more funding with every single year that passes in order to grow the organization? Or is it that as it grows, it actually gets easier because you now begin to generate profit? And if you begin to generate profit, you can begin to cover more of your costs, and therefore there's a natural economies of scale, and this thing begins to move. I think that's one of the questions that I would just put out there in looking at financing that model. If you go to the other extreme, the complete opposite strategy of growing your own organization is open source. And here is an example of where, I'm sure you've been speaking about it a lot in the last day or so. The idea is you don't try and set up subsidiaries in every country that you work. What you do is you simply have a flagship project which, basically perfects what you are doing in one country, and you tell the story to the world. Or you give away your knowledge, or your intellectual property, and you let other people take that knowledge and adopt it, and maybe even change it or adapt it, or do whatever they want with it. But essentially, you give up ownership of it and you pass it on. Again, there are some examples of successful models that are doing this. We know many from the commercial world. We know about those Wikipedias of this world. If you think about some of the social enterprise models that have done this, examples might be something like Kaboom in the United States, Darrell Hammond's organization, which is all about encouraging villages and towns to set up their own play groups, play areas where young people can play. And they basically put online all of their IP. So you can go onto their website, you can download all the information about how to set up one of these things, what works, what doesn't work, what you should be looking out for, how to build various games areas and play areas and so on. And anyone can download it. And so it's, it's a very, very low cost strategy for getting out there. And they've done that for hundreds of of villages and towns and replicated it very successfully. Again, you know, that might be the other kind of model. But there are a couple of questions with open source. I mean, one of them is that it's a very hard model to fund. You know, by definition, you're giving away your product. You're giving away your knowledge. And so pretty much the vast majority of these models tend to be only donations and grant funded. And essentially what you're doing with this kind of model is you're going out there and you're saying, please sponsor me if you like what I'm doing. So, you know, now that can work. You know, this is how Wikipedia is funded, right? So every year, Jimmy Wales, who's now a Shoka Fellow, by the way, you know, writes a letter to all the users of Wikipedia and says, by the way, guys, this is for free, what we give out. But if you like what we're doing, could you please come and support us and write a donation and make it easy to do that. And essentially, it's a click if you like me kind of model, and that's how they're funded. So you know, it has the other extreme, but it has a possibility. Just out of curiosity, are there any open source models in this room? Is anyone? Genetic Alliance probably would be an example of that, is that right? And in terms of your current funding,
right now it's 98% grant funding.
Right.
2% is fee for service for industry, that then the products get turned into open source.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And how have you found that as a model so far? I mean, you're obviously switching to investment now with the bonds, so clearly you're probably hitting the limits of what you can do with that.
So we went from $400,000 to $4 million in the last 8 years, the 8 years that I've done this.
Right.
Barack Obama stood last January and said he would cut government funding drastically, and the next day we were notified we'd lose $2 million of our $4 million. So half our budget gone. It's not going to be a grant climate for the next 10 years is our estimate.
Right.
So we have got to find another way to pay for all this.
Okay. So, I mean, again, a very, very common... Sorry, yes?
We're in the same area. What we do, we're an NGO that develops technology. So we develop software and about 12 different applications and websites. In about 2 years since we launched, more than 90% comes from grants.
Yeah.
All of the grants come from big tech companies, from eBay, Google, or Open Society Foundation, which is not tech, but you know, they did give us a big grant. Yeah. And we are, you know, actually talking about this model and how to be financially sustainable. We are worried about what's going to happen in the next years, because we now have lots of funding, and we are worried of how to use that funding kind of a startup way to develop something that could allow us to be financially sustainable in the midterm.
Okay.
Or the mid-long term. So the question is there perhaps you were going to present another hybrid model? Or
I'm just going to come on to it.
It's not only just releasing the code, which is what we do, because I know this is part of the rules of the game.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
We are fully open source.
Yeah.
But you can also do something in between, which is kind of self-service.
Exactly.
So it's
and I think you both highlighted exactly the limitations of this model. You know, there are examples of quite a few fellows who've been very successful with the open source model. But at a certain point in time, the grant funding runs out, or a big donor suddenly drops away, and suddenly there's a big problem. And so it's a very vulnerable model, actually, unless you can keep the overheads down to an absolute minimum. And so what we find is a couple of things. If we can just go on to the next one. So this model is, I call it sponsor me if you like what I do. And you know, an example of what a lot of fellows who basically work with the open source model find is that they have to supplement it in some way. And they explore various ways of doing this. So one example is one of the Ashoka fellows is Ken Banks from Kiwanja.net. They produce open source software which enables frontline organizations in developing countries to be able to utilize SMS technology, text messaging, in a very efficient way to broadcast to their people in the field, connect in various ways, and to do so in a highly efficient way. Frontline SMS, his organization, basically puts that software out there for free. Anyone can download it. I believe it's about 50,000 organizations that have downloaded some form of it, which they can then adapt. And that model has been entirely grant funded and donation funded, and Ken is incredibly good at doing that. But even so, despite somebody of Ken's success being able to do this, it's still, you know, it has its vulnerabilities. And so what a lot of them do is they explore, well, you know, there's a couple of ways of doing it, but one of them might be what's called a freemium model. Thank you. Which is where essentially you give away 98% of it for free, but there might be one or two ancillary services that you might be able to add on, which could be a consulting model, or it could be some kind of, you know, value added plus service. You know, this is the kind of, you know, like your Gmail account where you basically get it for free, but if you want certain special features that maybe, you know, that you have to pay for that, you know, or a LinkedIn model. To be quite honest, there aren't many examples that I know of where this sort of freemium model, where you have the basic service for free and then the premium service on top, has been that successful in the social enterprise space. You know, I think we're still looking out for some examples. So, but a lot of them do tend either to try and think about those models, or what happens is you end up doing consultancy work as a way to supplement the original basic premium, you know, the free model basically. And, you know, and the question is, can you find consultancy work which is aligned to your existing mission and work rather than being a distraction from it? I think it's one of the critical challenges that any entrepreneur with this model faces.
Yeah, but it still seems that even if you do both of them very good,
yeah,
you're not going to get close enough to any kind of drag.
I'm sorry, but there's a concern I have with this. I understand the need why for replication of scale that open source would have the value of that. I mean, I understand Cheng's model. But to connect that to sustainability and just what you said now about premium model, there's a fundamental problem in even looking at this as a way to even generate some revenue. Because the psychographic of the kind of organization or person that signs up for this is effectively about open source, free, and ongoing impact. Right? The value chain of the kind of organization or person involved here is not in the interest of paying for service. There could be very good people at the other end who want to source it free to give it to children free or whatever it might be. Right? The value chain itself is not about exchanging capital. It will be very difficult to even try to tag a premium on you, waste a lot of time and effort, because the way that mind and that system functions, it's not going to pay.
You're absolutely right. People who are used to the free model do not pay. I mean, that's the overwhelming lesson that just comes back again.
Even the Gmails and all of this.
They don't make money, and it's very, very hard to find ways to monetize that or have a premium user on top of that. I mean, look at Facebook, look at Twitter. You know, they really struggle actually, despite the fact that, you know, millions of users, billions of users to
attracted something free. And then hope to score at the other end. That's what really is. Very difficult.
It's very difficult, exactly. And so therefore, what tends to, what could happen then is that the entrepreneur needs to find some alternative way of doing this. And so there's kind of a third model which is kind of between open source and just do it all yourself. And it's what I call a hub and spoke model. And there's lots of different variations on this, but essentially what happens with hub and spoke is that you have your original organization, your central organization, and in order to replicate itself and its impact, what it's going to do is it goes out and it actually actively helps set up replicants of itself. And it interacts with those local partners, if you like, through various means which can be monetized. And I'm just going to talk about that in just a moment, but if we can, so here you have the hub, and the hub's role is to go and find local partners and help get them going. And Thorkill, you're probably one of the great examples of this model, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But if we can just keep moving to the next one. There are dozens and dozens of variations on this model, but let me just describe to you the basic pattern. It's your organization, I'm going to call it the hub, and what it does is it finds a local partner. It may be that local partner is somebody who actually approaches you and says, I've heard about what you're doing, I absolutely love it, I want to bring it to my country. Or in some cases it might be you that's going out and trying to find a local partner, in a different country. And so what's happening is that the hub is going to provide some kind of service to the local partner in exchange for a fee of some kind. And that's really the monetary relationship that exists between the hub and the local partner. And if we think about what kind of service this might be, I think there are broadly 4 categories of relationship between the hub and the local partner. And those are training, providing training and knowledge to help the local partner set up, supplies, or some kind of ongoing service that you deliver to the local partner. It might literally be supplies. It may be that you actually are a supplier of goods, solar lanterns, for instance, or drip irrigation, or whatever product it might be, which a local partner is distributing for you. Brand, in other words, the value of being seen as part of your network, Genetic Alliance, Earthrights International, whatever it is, being seen as part of that umbrella of that family. And finally, but rarely, but possibly, finance, actually financing that local partner, help them get going. So, each of these are kind of like 4 generic kind of services that a hub can provide to a partner, and each of them has a corresponding revenue stream, which can monetize that service or product. So in the case of training, essentially it's consultancy. You're going out there and you're acting as a consultant, and you're getting paid for that to deliver your IP, your knowledge and systems. If you're actually providing a good or a service, you're actually getting paid for that, so it's payment. Brand is a really interesting one. What's the value of the brand that you bring to an organization? If you're right to play, what's the value of an organization teaching football in Argentina to be seen as part of your family of organizations? Can you monetize that through a license or through some kind of royalty? And finally, if you're providing finance to that organization to help them get going, rather than you're looking at some kind of loan repayment or some kind of dividend from an equity stream. And I said, we can look at all these different organizations, and you can look at different ways in which they found some or all of these to monetize and create that revenue stream, which is the basis of finance. And if we look at, I've basically tried to come up with a sort of taxonomy of different organizations, types, that utilize a hub and spoke model. At one level, if you just give training services, then you're a consultancy. If you just provide supplies, you're a supplier. If the only thing you offer is the brand and you're inviting people just to be part of your network, you're an association. And if you do some or all of these, if you have the brand, but you're also providing training and supplies, that's really more of a franchise kind of model. And so this might be one way of thinking about the different kinds of relationship between the two and how you fit into that. But here's really the crux of it. This is where finance comes into it. If you decide that you have a hub and spoke model, and that you could be part of this spectrum or be one of these kinds of organizations, it has certain profound implications on how you raise finance. And I just want to draw out 2 of those implications for you. The first one is this. When you're thinking about raising finance, you now have to think about 2 things. You have to think about where do you actually want to raise the finance? Do you want to raise the finance at the local level, and invite funders and donors to come in and say, please help me to set up my organization in Nicaragua or in Costa Rica or in El Salvador or wherever it is? Or do you want them to come in at the hub level, at the central level, and say, please come and fund the central HQ because we are the nexus that makes everything else possible. We go out there and we set up in all of these different countries. Or is it some combination of the 2? And in the work that I've done with Ashoka Fellows and many other social entrepreneurs, this has been such an important question because the funders that you go to raise finance for each of these different levels are different kinds of funders. They come in with different instruments and with different motivations. And so what we've seen is that some of the organizations that have previously tried to go to one funder to do all of these things, to fund the central hub, but also to fund the local subsidiaries, and with a single ask and a single proposition, have struggled to raise finance, or find it harder because you're trying to do everything in one go. Whereas the organization has split these 2 out and targeted their investors and said, we should go and fund the hub in this way, and we should fund the local partners in this way, may actually have an easier time of doing this. So that's something which I just want to throw out there to you, is where does it make sense to raise the funding, and what kind of investment story do you want to tell to your funders based on whether it's the hub you want to fund or whether it's the local partner that you want to fund. So that's really one of the critical questions. Let me just give you an example of that. I work with an organization called PI Global, which stands for Partners for Youth Empowerment. It's run by Ashoka Fellow Charlie Murphy. And essentially the model is that they have a hub, which is a group of really brilliant youth trainers who are very skilled in going out and teaching the skills of youth facilitation to various organizations. And what they do is they go around the world, and they're operating in South Africa, they're operating in Uganda, just launched in Brazil, in India, and they find local partners who can then deliver those programs to youth, whether it's in schools or, or partner organizations or what have you. And when you're going out and you're raising funding, the story is different depending on the funder you're speaking to. So for instance, in India, the story is you go to local funders and you say, we really want to have this program in Delhi and Bangalore and Madras or wherever. And because we can reach thousands of kids with this program and the impact will be huge. And therefore, the local funder comes in, and typically they're people who want to see young people in Delhi or wherever, get the benefits of this program. So it's about local funding for a local cause with a local impact. Whereas for the people who are going to be funding the hub, the story is different. The story is not just the impact can be huge at the ground level, which of course it can, but the story is, please give us this money, because with this money we can go out and we can launch in this country and this country and this country, and it becomes about us being, this kind of generator of new partners and new subsidiaries. And so the impact investor who's coming in at the hub level, the impact that he wants to see is that your organization growing through the proliferation of partners and subsidiaries. And yes, of course, it's also about the impact on the ground as the indirect level, but it's really about how the hub can become catalytic in proliferating in multiple countries. And that's the impact story that most excites them. And so when they're looking for revenue streams, they're looking at the four kind of items that I mentioned: the brand, the license fees, the consulting fees, the supply payment, the loan repayment. And they're looking at that as the source of repayment of an impact investing instrument that might go into the hub, if that makes sense. And so it's actually quite a different kind of investor from the local investor. A different motivation, different kinds of repayment, and therefore potentially a different instrument. It gets more confusing because sometimes it's a donor at the local level, but an investor at the hub level. Or it can even be reversed. It might be that it's a donor at the hub level, but it's an investor at the local level. An example of this, Jack Sim from the World Toilet Organization was at the Globalizer here in Stockholm a few months back. And we actually helped him to completely change his business model. So we were sitting there actually at a workshop quite similar to this. And Jack was saying, he was really struggling with his growth model, because essentially he had what I call a strategy one model. In other words, create an organization that sells toilets all across the developing world. And he had 30 people out there trying to do this. It was very slow, it was very cumbersome, funding was incredibly hard to go and do this. And then after one of session in a panel, talking to his advisors and so on, Jack had the revelation that he didn't need to do this. He didn't need to go and create subsidiaries that would actually go and sell toilets to all of these. What he could do was switch to a hub and spoke model, where essentially he puts all the IP for creating a toilet, an affordable sanitary toilet, into a package that can be very easily passed on to others, with the relevant knowledge and the training and so on. So he provides the basic supplies, he provides all the knowledge and the training, but it's local entrepreneurs on the ground who then take his product and his training, and they make businesses out of it, to set up toilet creating organizations essentially. And with that, he doesn't need 30 people. He can go from 30 down to 3. And essentially what he's doing is he's out there, basically giving this IP, selling this IP to local entrepreneurs who can then create a livelihood from doing so. And so he's spun the model around from a type 1 model to a hub and spoke model. Now he's still in the process of doing this, obviously, but this potentially could be a way for him to scale much faster. His local entrepreneurs then have a business so they can raise investment to grow their business. And essentially what he's doing is he's looking either for grants or he's looking for an impact investor who's very sympathetic to his cause to come in and sponsor the central operation, which is about that hub, the knowledge and so on, to go and do that. So it's a different kind of financing strategy.